Ted Dabrowski, president of WirePoints, thanks for joining us here on the Illinois channel. And I want to bring up, for the purpose of our viewers, to bring them up to speed on something they may have not heard about, but is going to be an important issue coming up in the next election. And that is a proposed constitutional amendment to the Illinois Constitution that would make changes relative to labor unions. And we're going to be talking with Ted Dabrowski about this. But just before we started doing this interview, the Illinois House of Representatives voted to pass the effort to put this constitutional amendment on the ballot. So you, the voters, will be in all likelihood making the decision of whether or not this becomes the law and part of the Illinois Constitution. It will be has to be signed by the governor, but that is considered to be a no-brainer that he will do that. So Ted, before we start our own discussion of the issues, let's take a listen to what Representative Mazzocchi said just moments ago on the Illinois House floor about this effort.
People who are CEOs don't have the right to collectively bargain. People who are in very sensitive positions don't have the right to collectively bargain. And yet here, we're not doing the same sort of refined, nuanced type of meaning of employees that you have in a federal statute. One of the reasons why you can do that kind of nuance at the federal level is because it's in statute. Once you enshrine this at the constitutional level, any amendment, any change is going to be very difficult to reverse and overcome.
And that was Representative Mazzocchi. And Ted, you at WirePoints recently wrote something similar here, saying that drafters of the proposal have made it deliberately and deceptively ambiguous and misleading, but also radically broad and open-ended. By creating new constitutional right for themselves and their agenda, they would be throwing a cluster bomb toward everything in their way. The amendment's full impact may not be entirely certain, but it would for sure clear a path to a new, unimagined public union power. So Ted, you as the president of WirePoints, we understand that it is ambiguous, but is that the only problem you have with this, or are there other reasons that you are opposed to it?
The thing is that we have taken collective bargaining laws, collective bargaining rights, and removed it from the power of the legislature to legislate those laws and decide what kind of powers the unions may have. They've now taken that and put it directly into the Constitution, and if the voters approve it, then it will be impossible to amend, change our labor laws. And if you know anything about Illinois and its pension problems and its public sector cost problems, by putting that language and cementing it, enshrining it in the Constitution, these collective bargaining rights, it's real trouble to ever fix a state, because our legislature will be virtually powerless to do so.
When we talk about the changes that this would do, what actually is it changing? I mean, I can forgive the man on the street saying, well, what is this doing any differently? We already have the right to join a union. So what is this specifically doing that isn't there now?
Well, so if you look across the country, there's a whole bunch of an array of bargaining rights. You have a state like Virginia, which for the most part doesn't allow collective bargaining at all. I think Georgia is very similar to that. We're on the other extreme where teachers have the right to strike if they don't agree to a contract. And police and fire, for example, they can force binding arbitration if they don't like what's being negotiated. So we give really strong, probably the strongest powers in the country to our unions here, versus in other states. They may not have any power at all. The unions may not have any power at all. And so yes, we do grant those rights legally through legislation here in Illinois, but by moving the exact wording, by saying that the collective bargaining rights are they're in the Constitution, and we explicitly say for wages, for negotiations and different things, but including now economic welfare, we have really put all the power into the Constitution, and how we legislate our way out of that. There'll be battles all the time about what changes, what collective bargaining changes and collective bargaining laws are harming somebody's economic welfare. And this is the broad language that Representative Mazzocchi talked about. We don't know what economic welfare means, and we don't know whether that covers additional things that we've never thought about, or if we want to close, if we want to, let's say, combine two school districts, consolidate, and people lose their jobs. Is that their economic welfare that's protected by the Constitution now? These are the kind of things we don't know. And if you think about Illinois' property taxes being the highest in the country, we have to be able to control labor costs. And if we can't do that anymore, then there's no talk about reducing property taxes.
On that point of it being purposely vague, Mark Glennon, who works with you at WirePoint, said, in reference to the economic welfare, he says, what isn't a matter of economic welfare? Practically nothing. The Chicago Teachers Union has attempted in the past to include matters like affordable housing in its bargaining. Under the amendment, it would clearly have a strong case for demanding any number of such policies as part of its contract negotiations, and the same for any other union. So I guess, in one way, it seems like this might be a response to what Governor Rauner tried to do when he was saying that local counties ought to be able to have right-to-work provisions. And so the Governor Rauner then was saying, I'm not against unions, but there are various the economic landscape of the state varies widely. You have wealthy areas, you have poor areas. The Governor Rauner was arguing local areas ought to be able to say that we can contract with contractors that are not unions. And one of the things it says, and this is in the second part of the language here, note the last sentence, that it provides that these provisions are controlling over home rule powers. In other words, if this amendment were to pass, it would deny local government that right to be able to decide how and when they would use unions, because it would say in the Constitution of Illinois, you have to honor these provisions, and you have no right to change them, whether you're in Carbondale or Marion or Chicago.
That's absolutely right. And so, one of the big push for this amendment is to ensure that Illinois doesn't go right to work. There's 28 other states that are right to work states, and all of them except for Missouri, our neighbors, are right to work states where you're not forced to be in a union as a condition of employment. Illinois, that's what we would have to be in a union as a condition of employment. And that's also the case not just at this level, but for local. Around it did try to move this, and union members remember that. But I think a big part of this discussion, Terry, we have to remember that not everybody's in a union. The ordinary Illinois union, and this is where the problem comes in, because we're talking about protecting the little guy. Well, the little guy isn't in a union. Let me tell you this: the little have a 5-year, 3 contract like the union members. They don't get guaranteed raises. The public sector, for example, a guarantee like the public sector will do. Right, we're doing is we're protecting the public class by this amendment, expense of the ordinary Illinoisan who has to, for the guarantee of the public sector worker, the guaranteed contract to the public worker, the guaranteed rate benefits. This is going to be a big problem because our property tax is the highest in the nation, and the little guy has to pay those property taxes that go to those public sectors. How do we ever reach that if, in fact, we've got constitutional protection for pensions and constitutional protection for these collective bargaining rights? Our lawmakers' hands will be tied, and ordinary Illinois will have no relief.
Everyone knows that Illinois has been in a fiscal mess for years, that we have high property taxes. We know that people are leaving the state. We're going to lose a congressional seat because of the loss of population. You talk to people around the state. You talk to people. You're plugged into the business community. Certainly, I would expect, as you're coming to us from the Chicago area, that you know any number of people in the business community of Chicago. Are you hearing from them? And are you hearing, basically, based upon what I was just saying, that if this were to pass, would this lead to a further immigration out of Illinois as this would add just one more layer of regulations on doing business in the state.
I've learned one thing on things, so it's hard to say that tax impact whether people stay here or not. When you add up things that happen in Illinois, we've already said it's to live here. We've talked about this. We've talked about there's not enough jobs, as we've seen. Our nation struggle, certainly paying jobs, and our governments are too corrupt. And we see that there was the indictment today of Tim Mapes. That's another big issue. So those three things, when you just add up something like we can never become a right to work state, or we can't reform labor costs, our hands are tied. It's just going to chase more people out. When you add them all up at the margin, it's just another negative for Illinois. And if you're thinking about it, if you're a company thinking about moving to Illinois, and you think about the massive pension debts it already has, and then this amendment, which means you won't be able to reform any of those things. It's just another reason not to put up shop here, or at least at the margin, add more workers in other states.
Yeah, and in the article, again, by Mark Lennon, he says that if this were in the Constitution, and if there was an effort to change, let's say, pensions, it might be then ruled that the legislature no longer has the power to make changes to pensions because of this law. Now, I don't know how much of an argument that is, because people would say the Constitution of Illinois already prohibits, with the diminishment clause, the changing of pensions. Are you, as an organization, I would say you don't get involved in political fights. You're more about educating people and examining issues, which is why we wanted to talk to you about this. I think it is true that a whole lot of people around the state just haven't seen a lot of press coverage of this issue and really don't know how it would impact them. We know that Governor Pritzker just tried to have a constitutional amendment passed that would have raised taxes on people making over $250,000 a year, and that was defeated. Based upon that recent effort on a constitutional amendment, does that give you any indication from your vantage point of how the population might decide on this one, or to what extent might this be another major battle going into the 2022 election?
Well, I looked at the progressive tax hike. You had the way it was structured. It was 97% of people could expect either no hike or a lower rate, and they're voting against the top 3%. So it was a really easy, in theory, really easy to pass, 97-3, and yet it didn't. And the reason it didn't is because I think there was a lot of time spent educating the voters about the corruption in Illinois, the problems it would not fix, and the people eventually got it. And I liken this situation on this amendment as it regards to the union powers. I liken it to be very similar. I think once people figure out that this will be very bad for Illinois, it'll be bad for you won't ever get a property tax break again. When you start to realize that, I think through an education effort, people will learn that this is a bad amendment. It's a bad thing for Illinois, and it makes no sense.
I think some of the proponents are saying that this is not going to make a big difference, that they're just trying to enshrine in the Constitution the rights that are already utilized, because you might get a guy like Governor Rauner coming in and trying to diminish the right to collective bargaining. And so they're kind of saying this is not going to change the status quo.
Well, this is the problem, Terry, is that, in Illinois, it's not about, certainly in the private sector, we respect the right to collectively bargain and to gather together to negotiate. That makes sense. In the public sector, there's a big debate about whether public sector unions should exist or not. But what ordinary Illinoisans will have to understand is that today, those public sector unions get 3 to 5 to 10 year guaranteed contracts with guaranteed raises, guaranteed COLA adjustments, guaranteed benefits. It's unaffordable for the ordinary Illinoisan. It's not fair for the ordinary Illinoisan, because no matter how bad this economy does, the ordinary Illinoisan has to pay those costs. And so, this is not about a lot of the talk about unions and all that. It's about contracts that ordinary Illinoisans can't afford, and they shouldn't have those costs shoved down their throat all the time. So we need to find balance. So whether it's, Governor Rauner was was, of course, very aggressive about potential changes, but eventually we're going to have to roll back some of these labor laws because they're so union friendly and so taxpayer unfriendly.
Yeah, and we all see what's happening with our property taxes going up and up and up and pricing people out of their homes that they've been in for years. And again, this is to predominantly pay these ever-rising pensions, and they have a 3% annual COLA increase, and that is guaranteed by the Illinois Constitution. So when you put
and the ordinary
something,
person doesn't get that.
well, no one gets a pension, much less that. And I coincidentally was talking to an expert on the Constitution or the pensions today, and asked if you had the power to make changes, what would you do? And he said I'd at least cap the COLAs from going up for at least 5 years, and then whenever you bring those back, have it be half the CPI. And that would at least buy you some time. And even doing that, he said, wouldn't fix all the problems, but it would stop you from digging deeper, so to speak.
Hey, Terry, one important point I want to make is that any legislator that voted for this amendment should not be allowed to make promises about property tax cuts, because they can't say both things at the same time. If they voted for the amendment, that means they are against any property tax relief for people, and that's just the bottom line.
Why do you say that? I mean, how does it follow? Because
because it would be, again, if you look at the broad language, that you can't impact somebody's economic welfare. How will we litigate any of these things to bring down costs? It will be impossible, or it will be very difficult, because every time we try to make a reform on labor, we'll be thrown into the courts.
I think that's
and you can't get property tax relief without some of the collective bargaining reforms that are necessary, which include pensions as well, of course.
I'm reminded that Gary Johnson, the former governor of New Mexico, who I interviewed when he was running as a third-party candidate for president, mentioned to me that when he was governor, half the bills that they passed in the legislature was just to clean up the language of bills that were previously passed. That the language in bills is just often too vague, and that is, as we saw in the comments by Representative Mazzocchi, and as you wrote, or Mark Glennon wrote on your webpage, wirepoints.org, that the language here is very vague, and the argument from Wirepoints is that it's purposely vague to allow more fudging around. Now, people will...
Well, this is Illinois. So.
Right, and then people argue, well, then it goes to court, which, number one, adds a lot of cost to litigants to go to court, and that secondly, the courts often, again, being with the political realities of Illinois, are going to find with the unions. So it's not to say this is anti-union, but it is to say that if you're going to be having a constitutional amendment, it ought to be better worded. And as Mazzocchi said in a comment we didn't air as part of her comments, she goes, look at the problem we're having with the pensions because of a constitutional amendment they started back in 1970 when they wrote it, the Illinois Constitution, that pensions can't be diminished. And so now the legislature of 2021, 51 years after the Illinois Constitution was passed, their hands are tied. They can't make adjustments.
And that's the point.
When ideally a rational person would make an adjustment to control the state from going into the hole and going bankrupt.
Yeah, Terry, look, this stuff doesn't belong in the amendment. It belongs to the legislature to decide what kind of laws the people and when the state needs and wants. And it's important also to understand that we have neighboring states that compete with us. And Indiana is right to work, Wisconsin is right to work, Kentucky's right to work, Iowa's right to work, and they also have collective bargaining laws which are much more friendly, taxpayer friendly. We're at the other extreme, and so we've got to be able to compete with our neighboring states and the rest of the country. And what this does is this is like a dagger, because we won't be able to compete with any other state. I just call it economic suicide. You can't do this.
Yeah, when you are trying to bring new businesses in, which is a good way to grow your economy, and to get more tax revenues by having more businesses, more workers. It's going to make it ever harder when you just add this additional layer of regulation where there's not as much wiggle room to operate, to make managerial decisions when you're running a business. Business is hard enough, I say from experience, without having your hands tied on various issues.
Yeah, Terry, if you're a new company thinking about moving, or a company thinking about moving to Illinois, and you see those laws, and you just say, look, I'm not going to be able to negotiate anything that I want and need to compete. I've got this pension bill that's going to be hanging over my head, the highest property taxes in the nation. You got the workers' comp, high costs. Why put your business here? This amendment is just it's just going to be a massive misstep for this state if it passes. But I think the ordinary people will prevail in blocking this once they know what it means.
Well, we now know that the constitutional amendment has been passed by the legislature. It will most certainly be on the 2022 ballot. And as you say, it is up to the voters to now decide. They have to approve or disallow this constitutional amendment. Before we close out, any last word?
No, that's it. Unfortunately, some Republicans also voted for this, and so it means it's bipartisan. And I say unfortunately because the Democrats have strongly expressed their support for this, and it seemed like the Republicans would be more or the reformers in this approach. But only some have been. Of course, many voted no. So we'll have to see how that plays out in the messaging to the ordinary public.
Ted, on just before we close out, there's another big news item here that I don't know if you want to make a comment or not on. Tim Mapes, the former chief of staff for years to former House Speaker Michael Madigan, who, of course, Michael Madigan is now out of office as well. But Tim Mapes was indicted this afternoon. This is having to do with the ComEd investigation by the U.S. Attorney. Do you have any comments or thoughts on that?
Well, this just goes back to, why are we tying the same thing? We've got a corrupt government. We shouldn't allow them to pass legislation that binds the ordinary people in this way through the Constitution. And Tim Mapes and the whole mess there is just proof of why we have to give those guys limited powers. We can't give them this much power to pass laws or resolutions like this that tie people's hands and hurt them with higher taxes, higher costs, and of course a tougher standard of living.
And that was, by the way, one of the debate points on the House floor today. In this, that why are we taking up this constitutional amendment? We're not doing anything on ethics reform when we now have Tim Mapes indicted. We've had a number of other people who had been associated with the former House Speaker, as well as other people under indictment. And Illinois has a richly deserved reputation for being a corrupt state, and the hits just keep on coming.
Well, and everybody knows the cozy relationship between the unions and the political elite. They scratch each other's backs, and it's been that way for a long time. And so this amendment goes right in line with that.
Yeah. Ted Dabrowski, it's always good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us. And I'm sure between now and November of 2022, we'll be talking about this issue again, and always good to talk.
A lot. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.